All right, guys, so I'm going to go back a little bit to the slide we finished in class. So remember, the Byzantine Empire established the religion of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. We know that Constantine legalizes Christianity, which is a really significant moment in history, and that's why we kind of want to remember who Constantine was. So he establishes the Byzantine Empire. It's just the new name for the Eastern Roman Empire. So what was unique about the Byzantine Church under Constantine and then later Justinian is that it was an empire where the church and the state were connected. That's called Caesaropapism. Unlike in Western Europe where the Roman Catholic Church was independent from, the kings and the rulers, the Byzantine Church was a theocracy, which means there was no separation. Secularism is the opposite, where church and state are separated. So kind of try to understand that concept. The emperor, who was Constantine, and then later Justinian, he assumed the roles of both the head as head of state and the head of the church. Now he didn't necessarily run the church. He would appoint church leaders called patriarchs to do that, but he would call church councils into session. He would make decisions about religious doctrines and rules. And he pretty much treated the church as kind of a government department, like the Department of Defense. This was kind of like the Department of Religion. So that's what's really unique, and that's probably what you want to remember the most about the Byzantine Church or the Byzantine Empire. Religion doesn't matter if it's Eastern Orthodox Christianity or Hinduism or any religion for that matter. It does two things. Religion unites people and provides kind of a cultural identity that obviously helps unite people, right? So that was the case here. Throughout the Byzantine Empire, you'd see lots of relics, icons. An icon would be a painting of Jesus or Mary or other, saints or holy figures. If you go to a church, right, we know that that's common to see. These religious icons, right? Any kind of church. It could be a Catholic church, it could be a Protestant church. Now, it's interesting that not everyone was for that. There were a group of Byzantine leaders called iconoclasts who wanted these icons removed. They did permit prayers to crosses, but they believed that these icons violated the second commandment of the Hebrew Bible. There were attacks on this movement, so again, the empire was kind of divided on this. But Irene, who was the widow of Leo IV, when she became ruler, and here's a woman as ruler, right? So whether it's Empress Wu or the Egyptian pharaohs, right? We do see women, ruling here. Anyway, Irene did return to the icon system, so she's kind of given credit for that. But here's another, woman who's kind of, even though it's a patriarchal system, women did have some political power. At least in this case, they had a ruler. So that's Irene. All right, so monasteries are very important, and you want to remember the purpose and the idea of a monastery. Whether it was a Buddhist monastery or a Christian monastery, monasteries were centers of prayer, work, and usually education, right? So, the Catholic Church built monasteries, the Orthodox Church built monasteries. So it's a continuum, right? Places of worship and education. They would provide aid during disasters. Now, the Catholic monasteries did provide education, but in the Byzantine Empire, they did not, and that's kind of a big difference. The monasteries opposed iconoclasm, and one of the most famous monks would be Cyril. And Cyril is important because he kind of establishes or creates an alphabet, and that alphabet would be adopted by the Russian and Slavic people. If you've ever seen Russian or heard people speak Russian, that language kind of stems from this Cyril. It's called the Cyrillic script, and and that's important because it just made it easier to read and understand the Bible and any other religious text. He's translating that Bible into this language that's easier for local people to understand. And that's really going to help convert people when they can read and understand the Bible instead of just listening to an interpretation by a priest. So that's Cyril or Cyrillic script. Definitely remember that. All right, so how did the Byzantine Church compare to the Orthodox Church? There were a lot of commonalities. For example, they both believed in the teachings of Jesus. They both used the Bible as their source, and they believed in sacraments. These would be things that you need to do in order to get to heaven, like be baptized, a confirmation. Even at the end of your life, there are last rites. Obviously, weddings and marriages have religious undertones. These churches had a hierarchy. The patriarch would kind of govern, and bishops and priests would do the daily activities within those churches. And these religions had missionaries. And don't forget the monasteries, right? But these missionaries would travel all over the world to convert people. Both Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox were intolerant. I know we talked about that, but we're going to go with this church was intolerant of other groups. And when we get into the Middle Ages, we're going to see Muslims were sometimes attacked. Jews were attacked by the Christian peoples. So we're going to go with intolerance. Unlike Islam, right, that was tolerant, or the Persian peoples or the Buddhist peoples, this is going to be an intolerant society. All right, how is it different than the Catholic Church? Well, the Eastern Orthodox Church obviously was centered in the Byzantine Empire. The priests, the services were in Greek. Priests could grow long beards, and priests could get married. They also rejected the authority of the Pope, right? They did not believe that the Pope was a communicator with God. The Catholic Church was, the priests spoke in Latin, which made it hard for the people to understand. So most people had to rely on what the priest said. They couldn't read the Bible because it was in Latin, for example. So again, they were very reliant on the priest, even when he did speak Latin. But usually they also spoke the local languages as well. Priests would shave their faces. Also, priests were celibate. Again, they could not get married. That's actually changing today. The Pope is actually changing the rules a little bit to recruit or get more people into the priesthood. And the Roman Pope was the sole authority for Christians everywhere. It was believed that the Pope was a messenger of God or a messenger to God. So he was very important. So in 1054, there was kind of a seminal moment. Both churches excommunicated each other, which basically meant a split. So from 1054 on, you're going to have two very distinct Christian religions, Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity. And from that point on, they would kind of not always get along. During the Crusades, Roman crusaders went into Constantinople and murdered Orthodox Christians. So, definitely enough differences for there to be, some tragedy. All right, what about trade and commerce? We played a little activity. It's kind of, to reinforce this idea. Constantinople was a major player in the Silk Roads, right? It was right there in the Middle East, probably the biggest trading center in the world at the time. Byzantine currency was not only used in the Byzantine Empire, but all over the Mediterranean. And currency is a great example of a government or a state supporting the economy by creating a uniform currency, and that's really evident in the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine products were, jewelry, silver. Also, they would take the silk from Asia, and they would produce textiles. So, you're talking about a city that manufactured things, right? Textiles, for example, linen, wools, jewelry. So that's a little different, right? They're not just mining for things, but they're actually producing things with that gold and silver. Probably most of the gold and silver was coming from Africa, but it's possible that there were mines in this part of the world too. All right, so what were the labor systems? right? That's a main concept. Um, there were peasants like China, like India, right? Like really anywhere at the time. But you had free and unfree peasants. Some peasants were free and they could leave the land and go to another manor. But for others, laws and debt kept them under the control of a landowner. They also had a theme system, and I think that's important to remember that you could actually earn your freedom if you joined the military. So I always go back to slaves in America. The British offered slaves their freedom if they would join the British during the military. Washington wouldn't bring on slaves, so there were a lot of slaves that joined the British against the United States. This is called the theme system, right? The ability to earn your freedom. And this is all part of the concept of labor systems. All right, what about social class? Well, there was a lot of tension, like every civilization, it seems like. The land and wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few people. Um, this is definitely going to be commonplace in France later on, but landowners and the wealthy paid fewer taxes compared to others, so that's not going to go over very well. And there was actually a peasant revolt. You want to kind of remember these, right? We have Spartacus's rebellion, the Yellow Turban Rebellion, and then the Free Peasant Revolt here in the Byzantine Empire. Around 1277 CE, there were a couple of them actually. And in both cases, the nobles tried to take freedom away from the peasants. And one peasant leader was Basil the Copper Hand. You don't have to remember his name, but just thought it was kind of a funny name. But there was leadership here, right? There were men that would lead these revolts. So, but same thing, the idea of lessening freedom, causing. Remember back in the Yellow Turban Rebellion, there was this issue over the ruler would give land to the peasants, and the nobles were not happy, so you had these kind of social class warfare situations. So the Free Peasant Revolt, definitely underline that and get it in your notebook. All right, so what's the long-term impact of the Byzantines? They maintain Roman achievements, like I think we did that at the beginning of the notes, right? Roman roads, Roman architecture, Roman law. They also preserve the ancient Greek writings. That's important. The Islamic communities are going to do the same thing. Europeans were not known for that, so thanks to the Byzantines and the Muslims, we can read the works of Socrates and Plato. This impacted scientists and philosophers who could continue to learn from the Greeks and the Romans. So that's the really important piece here, right? The preservation and continuation of Greek culture. All right, so real quick, we're going to do a little activity on Justinian. He's known for this code, right, where he's preserving and kind of implementing Roman law in a sense. He also maintained Greek language. It was the language of the empire, and like laws, language and law unifies an empire. Right? I'm sorry, like religion. His wife was Theodora, and I should have underlined it. I think you should remember her. Theodora was, it's believed she was a prostitute who fell in love with Justinian, and once she was queen, she actually abolished prostitution and tried to fight for women's rights. So I think she should definitely be in your notes. Justinian had some challenges, a great plague, and also there was constant opposition from the noble class, not to mention the social class tensions. What else? As an expression of his gratitude, kind of a little Confucianism here, right? Respect the people. He built the Hagia Sophia. It's a very famous church. You'll probably see it as a source at some point in time. And here we see the Roman influence, right? The dome. So great example of Roman architecture transferring to another part of the world. He successfully manages borders, but eventually, though, the Byzantine Empire would be overtaken by Muslim empires. He lost the city at Antioch, not his empire, to the Sasanian Empire in Iran. But he did expand into Africa, Spain, and Italy using military force. So we give him credit for kind of maintaining the empire. It doesn't fall during his reign. All right, so about the plague, there are really two famous plagues. the great the the Great Plague of Europe later on in the Middle Ages, and then also this is Justinian's plague in 541. Both plagues have similarities. Hundreds of thousands of people killed, especially in cities, and basically it's because of fleas. Fleas carry the disease. They're carried on rats. Fleas bite people, bite animals, and that's how it kind of spread. As a result, and this happens in Europe later on, cities were decimated and people die, and there's no tax revenue. That's going to make it easier or harder to maintain an army, and that's going to make it easier for a nation to be invaded. Because of that, a barter economy emerged, not as much trading silver for products, but trading a good for a good. Merchants, because of the economic issues, became farmers, so there was a big economic overhaul because of this plague. And like I said, because the government could not raise taxes to fund a military, that exposed the empire to Islamic expansion, right? So the Roman Empire falls to invaders, and the Byzantine Empire falls to invaders. Remember, the Han struggled with disease, but they were just overtaken by another Chinese empire. That's the difference. All right, so we're going to do a couple slides on the Germans. The modern day Germany and modern day France were part of an empire called the Frankish Empire. It used to be part of the Roman Empire until nomadic groups came, poured in and kind of took over. But eventually those nomadic groups would kind of come together, and you'd see the emergence of European empires. And the most famous early empire was the Empire of the Franks. Socially, you're going to see family units, not so much social class early on, but families. And within those families, you're going to have kind of dad in charge or the father, so we see patriarchy. From a political standpoint, they had an early example of democracy. It was called the Thing. It was basically a citizen assembly where the people got together to settle disputes or even plan war campaigns. And they actually had an interesting law called the Salic Law. They didn't have a set of laws, but they did have one law that said if you killed someone, that there was a price to pay. Human life did have a monetary value. So if you killed someone, you had to pay up for that loss of life. And the whole purpose was to prevent violence between families. That's what you're going to see. You're not going to see war between, say, a region or a province. It was really between families. Not a really centralized government early on, but that's going to change. And we see the first ruler, or probably one of the earlier rulers, was a man named Clovis. He was part of the Merovingian dynasty. You don't have to remember that. But Clovis is important. In 481, he's going to take over. He's going to use his military power, and he's going to establish alliances with other countries other regions through marriage to increase his power. He's going to use war bands, to kind of conquer. They were loyal to him mostly because he took care of them, but loyalty only went so far, and obviously if he wasn't going to be able to take care of them, they probably would have turned on him. You see a lot of old movies from this time, and not old movies, but movies about this time period, and the men have long hair, and that was a sign of a war leader. So a lot of these men are going to have very long hair. Early on, they're polytheistic, but eventually, under Clovis, we're going to see a conversion to Roman Christianity. So the Frankish Empire slowly converts as well, and religion, like law, unites an empire. So Clovis uniting the Frankish Empire under Christianity. All right, the next ruler is Charlemagne. He's also important. He's going to rule the Franks in 768. By this time, the Frankish Empire was Catholic, and he's basically going to be kind of the first Holy Roman Emperor. Eventually, the Frankish kingdom would be turned into the Holy Roman Empire, but Charlemagne was kind of deemed emperor by the Pope. The Pope recognized his power and also his influence and his ability to spread Catholicism, so he's named emperor. But you probably won't have a question on him. But what we're seeing is the Pope more involved in political affairs, right? We're seeing, the beginnings of a Holy Roman Empire, an empire that's kind of governed through the church. As ruler, he's going to conquer North and Central Italy, Spain, and Germany. So that's Charlemagne. All right, so what's the social structure like of Franks? Under Charlemagne, you're going to see some change. You're going to go from families and war bands to two classes. The potentes are powerful, or the paupers, or the powerless. I doubt you'll see this on a test, but it's more examples of, again, rigid social classes with landowners on top and then laborers and peasants on the bottom. Now, slavery, we always want to recognize slavery around the world. We're going to see slavery in Europe, mostly war captives. But what's interesting is you're going to see these people traded to Islamic empires. You're going to see the trade, the exchange of labor from Europe to the Islamic world. And I think that's kind of unique at the time. But the Christian leaders didn't quite agree with this, so there was a lot of criticism of Charlemagne for trading or engaging in the slave trade. So this is like a really early slave trade. All right, the Vikings. This is kind of the last group of people we're going to learn about. The Vikings, not just the football team in Minnesota, but they were Scandinavian boatmen from this part of the world, right up here in Norway, Finland, and Sweden. They invaded England. They traveled to Greenland. They invaded Russia, Iceland, and they even traveled to the Americas. They didn't settle there, but they did kind of, sail around. They are best known for their technology and their ability to overcome geographical barriers, basically oceans, right? Also, because of their invasions, I guess rulers recognized that they needed to develop a system that would create defense and protection. So we're going to see the emergence of feudalism, a system where a ruler would have knights and soldiers that were loyal to him. In exchange, he would give them land and protection as well. So that's the feudal system. And again, it's going to develop some in part to these Viking invasions. The Vikings were Germanic speaking. They were fishermen, hunters, and whale hunters. And the technology that they developed was the longboat, the ship that could travel very easily across oceans and along shallow rivers. That's how they made it into Russia. And the Vikings are going to kind of move into England. They would absorb with an earlier migrant tribe called the Anglo-Saxon people. So, I'm English. I have a little Viking blood in me, I guess. Who are the Anglo-Saxons, real quick? They were migrants from Germany and Denmark. They, too, were Christians. A very famous historian, Bede, actually developed the concept of BC and AD. Now, we don't call it that anymore. We call it BCE, before the Common Era. But, when I was your age, it was before Christ, and Anno Domini. Not sure what that means. Our days of the week are based on Scandinavian gods. For example, Woden became Wednesday. He was a god of war, and he created man. So our days of the week kind of have Viking influence in them. All right, a little more about the Vikings. They were small farmers. They had extended families. Women, again, this is that theme of women. Women actually Viking women had property rights in divorce, like Persian women, right? Like Mesopotamian women. They conquered in war bands. You would fight because you would be given the gifts of plunder. There is evidence that there was trade with Muslim empires, the Abbasid. We know that slaves were traded for silver coins. How do we know that? Because gifts were common between Viking rulers and rulers who came in contact with the Vikings. So we know that's the case because a Buddhist statue was found in Sweden. So we believe it's because of these gifts that were exchanged. The Vikings were also polytheistic until they eventually converted to Christianity around 1030. All right, so last two slides, Russia. Russia used to be known as it was a region called Kievan Rus. Rus is basically Rus would be the group of people, basically Viking migrants who moved into this region along rivers, and then they mixed with Slavic people, and the combination of Viking and Slavic people, that's the name Rus. So Rus or Russia. The city-state, or the most famous city-state of this region, was Kievan Rus. Eventually, the capital of Kievan Rus would be named Kiev, which is still the capital of Ukraine today. So kind of, an interesting, again, this is a region that was not unified or centralized. It was a region that, again, had a mixture of people, but slowly but surely you're going to see centralized governments emerge. Like the Byzantines, they also absorbed, Cyrus, right? His script would be adopted by these people. And that's because Byzantine missionaries would travel into that part of the world. So the people of this world not only would borrow from the Byzantine alphabet, but they would also start to adopt Orthodox Christianity. So it's more of a region, not a kingdom. You don't really have a king. You have small rulers in each little city-state. The most important city-state, or the largest city-state, was this Kievan Rus. And Slavic people, again, these are the people who the Vikings would merge with. Here's a great example of the Cyrillic alphabet, right? Very similar to our own alphabet, right? If you kind of take a peek. At least A, right? B, T. All right, so the most famous early Russian leader was a man named Prince Vladimir. He was the ruler of Kiev, or Kievan Rus, this region. He adopts Byzantine Orthodox Christianity. It was recommended to him by a group of men. The reason he wanted a religion was to unify the people of the region. Also, there were ties with the Byzantine Empire, trade ties, so that made sense that they would adopt the same religion as the Byzantine Empire. Vladimir was also drawn to the splendor and the wealth of Constantinople. I think he wanted to kind of mimic those cities. He also was mesmerized by the beauty of the Eastern Orthodox churches like Hagia Sophia. As a result of his conversion, he received a sister of a Byzantine Empire as a bride. So that's that, they're combining, at least in this case, families. And Byzantine priests and advisors traveled to Kiev to kind of help absorb or help teach the people. And he actually threatened the people. Didn't tell them what was going to happen, but he ordered them to the local river, and thinking it was going to be kind of bad, instead he performs a mass baptism. So just kind of a little side story, but he actually baptizes the people of his city, and that's how they're converted. Kievan Rus, or early Russia, adopts many Byzantine cultural elements. Not only the Cyrillic alphabet, but the architectural styles of the Byzantine Church, the use of icons, the idea of the monastery, and within that monastery, you'd have prayer and service, and this idea that the state would control the church is also going to emerge here. So there's a little cultural and political exchange between one empire and more of a region, right? A region, not an empire. All right, that's it. So if you have to go back